In the autumn of 1095, in a field outside the French city of Clermont, a man stood on a platform and spoke words that launched one of the most consequential and most catastrophic mass mobilizations in human history. And what is extraordinary is not that Pope Urban II gave the speech, but that it worked, that the words he spoke to an outdoor crowd of French nobles and clergy produced within months a movement so enormous and so sociologically unprecedented that the chroniclers who tried to describe it reached instinctively for the language of natural disaster. They wrote that Europe had physically tilted and poured its population eastward, and what poured out was not an army in any conventional sense. It was a civilization in motion, a migration of nobles and peasants and priests and thieves and children and women, and the genuinely devout and the nakedly opportunistic, all moving together toward a city most of them had never seen and could barely locate on a map, moving through landscapes that killed them by the thousands before a single enemy sword was drawn, moving through Hungary and Bulgaria and Anatolia on roads that turned to mud in winter and dust in summer and that offered disease and starvation. An ambush in proportions that should have ended the enterprise before it crossed into Muslim territory. And the question scorching at the center of this story, the question that the bones of the 100,000 people who died getting there are still asking, is how did they actually take Jerusalem, and what did taking it cost? And was the thing they built on the ruins of that cost worth any price at all? Urban II's speech at Clermont survives in 4 different versions written by 4 different chroniclers, none of whom were present, which tells you immediately that you are dealing not with a recorded historical event, but with a mythology already in the process of constructing itself, and the actual forces that produced the First Crusade are considerably more complex than any version of that speech contains, because the Papacy in 1095 was fighting a bitter political war with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over the question of who controlled the appointment of church officials, a conflict that had produced the extraordinary spectacle of an emperor standing barefoot in the snow at Canossa, begging papal forgiveness. And a successful crusade would enormously amplify papal authority and prestige at exactly the moment that authority was most contested. And the Byzantine Emperor Alexios III Komnenos had sent ambassadors to Urban requesting military assistance against the Seljuk Turks, who had taken Anatolia and were pressing toward Constantinople, a request for mercenaries that Urban transformed into something Alexios had not asked for and would spend the subsequent years desperately trying to manage. And the crusading army itself was not one army, but 4 separate forces that moved independently toward Constantinople, and that harbored between them rivalries and ambitions so incompatible that their eventual military cooperation against a common enemy represents one of the more improbable collective achievements in medieval military history. The siege of Jerusalem in June and July of 1099 is where the story reaches its climax, and where the historical record becomes simultaneously most detailed and most morally demanding. Because the Crusaders who arrived at Jerusalem's walls after 3 years of marching and dying and fighting their way across 2,000 miles were not the same people who had left Clermont. They were harder and more desperate and more reduced in number, perhaps 12 to 13,000 fighters remaining from the 100,000 who had set out, and they built siege towers from timber so scarce they had stripped the surrounding landscape bare and carried beams from the coast on their shoulders. And on July 15th, 1099, the towers reached the walls and the Crusaders poured into the city, and what happened next is described by the Crusader chroniclers themselves with a specificity and a casualness that is more disturbing than any external accusation. The massacre of Jerusalem's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants was not incidental to the capture of the city. It was comprehensive. The chronicler, Raymond of Aguilera, waded through blood to the temple. Mount and described it reaching the knees of the horses, a figure almost certainly exaggerated, but gesturing at a reality that the archaeological and documentary evidence confirms was catastrophic. And the Crusaders then knelt in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and wept with joy. And the juxtaposition of those 2 images, the blood and the tears, is the image that the First Crusade cannot escape, and has never escaped. The uncomfortable archaeology of the First Crusade extends in directions that the popular tradition of both its admirers and its critics has consistently avoided, because the Crusader states that emerged from the conquest of Jerusalem, the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the county of Tripoli and the Principality of Antioch and the county of Edessa were not the monolithic outposts of Western Christian civilization that the mythology presents, but something far stranger and more hybrid, the Crusader. Nobility that settled in the Levant adapted to their environment with a pragmatism that would have horrified Urban II. They adopted local dress in the heat, they learned Arabic, they employed Muslim administrators and physicians, they negotiated truces and trade agreements with Muslim rulers that their co-religionists in Europe condemned as collaboration. And the Crusader chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, writing a generation after the conquest, described the settlers with genuine astonishment as people who had become Easterners, And the Muslim and Jewish and Eastern Christian populations who lived under Crusader rule existed in arrangements that ranged from tolerated subordination to systematic exploitation, depending on the lord, the location, and the decade, a complexity that neither the celebratory nor the condemnatory tradition has found it useful to fully inhabit. The First Crusade ended not with the establishment of a stable Christian state in the Levant, but with the creation of a permanent emergency, a colonial outpost perpetually dependent on reinforcement from a Europe that would provide that reinforcement inconsistently and expensively across the next 2 centuries, until the whole enterprise collapsed with the fall of Acre in 1291. And what it left behind in the world was not a liberated Jerusalem. Jerusalem changed hands repeatedly in the following centuries, but a set of consequences, so vast and so entangled that historians are still mapping their full extent, the trauma. It inflicted on the Jewish communities of Europe, whom crusading armies massacred in the Rhine Valley on the way east in 1096, and pogroms that established patterns of organized anti-Jewish violence that would recur across the subsequent centuries. The rupture it deepened between Eastern and Western Christianity that the Fourth Crusade would later make irreparable, the specific quality of religiously justified territorial violence that it introduced into the political vocabulary of Westerns. Civilization, and that has never entirely left it. And today, when the word crusade appears in a political speech or a military communique, it arrives trailing this entire history behind it, whether the speaker intends it or not. And the field outside Clermont, where Urban II spoke his world-altering words, is farmland now, unmarked, unremarkable. And the question it asks of everyone who knows what happened there is the question that all origin points of catastrophic historical movements eventually ask, which is this. At the moment, the crowd roared its approval, and the word Deus Vult rose into the French autumn air. Was there a single person present who understood what they were actually starting? And if there was, did they hesitate? And if they hesitated, what made them cheer anyway?